Hey everybody, welcome back to Health. Today we're going to kind of combine a couple of chapters and talk about drug misuse and addiction. I'm not going to go into a super great amount of detail, and I'm definitely not going to um, uh, pass any kind of judgmental talk or anything. I'm just going to present the science of drugs and addiction. Um, we don't care about that. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so let's talk a little bit about psychoactive drugs and addictive behavior. So what is what? So what's a drug? A drug is so if you are from the U.S. and especially if you grew up in the '80s, you had to go through a program called DARE, which is a public service program that is designed to raise awareness of drug use and its any detriments that different drugs have. And I remember I learning in fifth grade, we had to repeat the definition of a drug over and over so many times that I remember it. Drugs are anything other than a food that alter the way your mind and body work. Okay, so that is probably the only good thing that came out of DARE, as far as I think a lot of their scare tactics actually worked very much against what they were going for, and they said things about, oh, if you ever smoke marijuana, you'll have so many hallucinations, and then that turns out not to be true. So it was very much a scare tactic of the '80s, trying to scare people off of drugs, which is not how it works, and we're going to talk about why that's not an effective strategy a little bit without getting political. But drugs are anything that alter a person's experience or consciousness. So this can be a good thing if we're talking about antidepressants. So to just say a drug is bad is not getting the full effect. Okay, so but we're talking about psychoactive drugs. These things can cause intoxication. So intoxication is a state in which sometimes unpredictable physical and emotional changes occur. So this could be something such as a misdiagnosed or misprescribed antidepressant or mood altering drug, or it could be a street drug such as ecstasy or cocaine that people are using specifically to get that kind of effect. Okay, so once habits of using these kind of drugs get out of control, you could possibly get a negative effect on someone's health, and that's when this becomes very problematic. Okay. So what is addiction? And that's what we're really talking about, addiction. So addiction is a chronic disease that disrupts the brain systems that regulate motivation and reward, and then therefore that regulate disrupts the systems that regulate behavior, basically. Okay, so we see, because of people trying to change their physiology based on how a drug affected them, they tend to change their behavior, and this is a psychological change in which you get these nearly uncontrollable pursuits of physical or psychological rewards and or the relief through a substance use or behavior. Okay, so such as gambling. Gambling is a very addictive behavior if you are a gambling addict. The idea being, and it's actually the same part of the brain that is activated during drugs. We're going to talk about how dopamine is, and that's this next part, the change in brain chemistry. Part of that is the rush of the high of that intoxication feeling, which is mediated through dopamine and some other neurotransmitters, which tells you you've done a great job, good, this feels awesome, whatever you just did feels great. And usually this happens during intense exercise or during sex or other such activities, which are normal physiological responses. But drugs find a way to short circuit that system. So instead of doing things that are naturally going to release dopamine, such as seeing a loved one, etc., we can make dopamine be released more easily, and then we feel good, we feel awesome. But we get addicted to that feeling of feeling good and other things that are changed in our brain, so that then we develop a tolerance for whatever that drug is, because suddenly you have to keep taking more and more of it to get that same high, to get that same dopamine feeling, which is problematic, because then other factors could also be increased that are dangerous. And then we change our behavior to try and go after whatever that thing that makes us feel good is, which is also very problematic. So there is a continuum on which we define substance abuse or addiction. Okay, so addiction has a very negative connotation. So when talking about these kinds of things with people, you tend to say substance use disorder rather than addiction, because addiction tends to get people very negative. You end up even inadvertently applying negative feelings to the word addiction, but substance use or substance abuse tends to get less of a negative feeling out of it. Okay, so we have a spectrum from mild to severe based on these criteria laid out in this Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Okay, and it has to do with how many specific criteria somebody meets. Okay, so we're going to see that it's basically, can you check certain things off? And this definitely is not everything you could see in somebody who's going through an addiction. But if you use whatever the substance is in large amounts for longer periods of time than intended, just like, oh no, I just want one more drink, just one more drink, just one more. Now, if you're doing this in public to be social, that's one thing. But if you're doing it and no one can make you stop doing it, and especially if you're doing it at home, then it becomes very problematic. Okay, if you have an intense desire or urge for the drug, if you have cravings, very, very intense, you can't fulfill major obligations as a result, you don't do any of your favorite activities or hobbies because of this, etc., etc. The more of these things you check off, the more intensely your substance use disorder is classified. Okay, so I definitely have known people in my life who will skip work to go drink, and they will go through periods of horrible withdrawal syndromes, which is actually really bad. If you have an addiction problem, you shouldn't quit cold turkey, because you can actually hurt yourself by doing that. You need to go through a rehabilitation program which will wean you off it and then give you something else that will help you your brain adjust to it without going through that shock of just being without it. So what happens? What is addiction? So this often starts as a way to bring pleasure or avoid pain. Okay, so a lot of times people will do it to feel alive because they're really depressed, or they have post-traumatic stress disorder and they can't feel, they don't get that normal dopamine high that makes them feel good. Okay, or they'll do it as a way of reinforcement. Okay, so some aspect of the behavior causes pleasurable physical and or emotional states. So whatever they're doing, maybe they're going out to celebrate some sort of a win of some sort, so they have a beer. And then, oh, well, this is awesome, let's do it some more. Let's reinforce that happiness. Clearly, I need both of these things. And then once the excuse for it goes away, or you develop a tolerance, you can go through withdrawal. And those can be very intense symptoms. So how come one person can have one beer and they suddenly have an addiction problem, and other people can drink and stop drinking or use drugs or whatever, and it's no big deal? Well, there's so many different factors that affect whether or not you have an addictive personality, or if you're likely to become addicted to certain substances. It could be your personality or your lifestyle. So are you just someone who is, you just know, oh, I'm not going to drink at all unless I'm with people, or maybe you're the opposite and you have a kind of lifestyle where you're always having to have drinks with clients or something like that. So those are purely social aspects, but there's also this idea of heredity. If you have an alcoholic in your family, you are more likely to have alcoholism, so that gene can be passed down. There are social and physical environments which very much relate to this lifestyle idea, and then the nature of the substance or behavior in question. So are you often engaged in risky behaviors? Are you often around the drug, whatever it is? That becomes incredibly problematic when you're trying to avoid whatever that addiction in question is. Okay. So what's happening on the physiological side? Are we wired for addiction? People, this is very much a buzz sentence that you see in different magazines like The New Yorker and stuff. So does our brain want us to be addicted? Is there this idea that under normal circumstances we release a little bit of dopamine, like when we're eating a food we really like, but then when cocaine comes in, it releases a flood of dopamine and it feels so awesome, oh my god. So are we screwed? Is this something that we're just always going to have to worry about? Maybe, and it could be that's why drugs do what they do. We found some random substance that makes us feel even better than normal life. The problem is when the substance is gone, how do you adjust for that? And then if you're only going after that substance and not living life, you're not an overall healthy person. And because there's so many aspects to your health. Oh, excuse me. So there are other pleasurable activities that can share this exact same brain chemistry, such as gambling, and eating, exercise, and sex, all trigger the exact same neurotransmitter that cause pleasurable rushes, just like a psychoactive drug, like I said. The difference is how much and how much work you have to put into it. I always tell all of my classes, overall, nature is really lazy. It's going to take the pathway of least resistance. It's going to do the thing that uses up the least amount of energy and is the easiest thing to do. So if your brain is suddenly really happy because smoking makes you feel awesome, then you're going to have a craving to do that thing because it feels great, right? Whereas if running a marathon, a lot of times people talk about runner's high. So you start running, you get to a point where you feel great, and it's this combination of dopamine and oh my gosh, what are they called? Endorphins, which endorphins they numb you to pain, and dopamine makes you feel like it's a pleasure, it's a reward response. So if you have those two things because you're running a marathon, then you're going to feel awesome. But it's a lot easier to sit and smoke a cigarette than it is to go out and run a marathon. So your body wants you to do the easy thing. Your brain wants you to do the easy thing. That doesn't mean it's the healthiest thing. Okay, so although the development of addictions are different, there are common characteristics for people with addictions. What are those things? So, substance or activity is used as a substitute for healthier coping strategies. How many of us know someone who, if they're going to go to a party, or maybe we are this person, if we're going to go to a party, you're going to have a drink in your hand because you aren't comfortable just talking to people, because maybe you're very introverted, or maybe you're at a party where you don't know anybody, then you say, well, I just need a drink to loosen up, okay? And that is what alcohol does. It does decrease our inhibitions. And if our inhibitions are something that are affecting our social behavior, then it does feel like that helps you, right? But there are healthier options for coping with social situations, such as talk therapy and just exposure therapy, just going to these situations that you might feel more uncomfortable around. Okay, if you are going through a hard time and you're dealing with stress and painful emotions, so those painful emotions are doing the exact opposite of what dopamine does. They don't make you feel like you're rewarding yourself. They don't make you feel great. They make you feel awful, like you're doing something wrong, even if you're not. So it's very easy in those cases to, for some people to then go for a substance that will turn that dopamine response back on, a substance or a behavior that turns it on. There could be just various genetic predispositions that change our brain chemistry. This could be due to trauma, or just genetically you don't have a lot of, maybe your response when you eat food you really like doesn't release a whole lot of dopamine, or you're asexual and so you don't have that pleasure during sex that then releases dopamine. But the drugs are still going to be effective, okay? And so they're still going to get that reward factor down into your brain that other things are not doing. So that can be very problematic, okay? So you can imagine if you've never had an orgasm and then suddenly you take a drug that basically makes you feel like that same release of happiness is going on in your brain, that it's very likely that could become an addictive response. People with impulse control and self-regulation problems will definitely can have problems with addiction, because in this case, they don't have the willpower to just say, I don't need to drink wine as soon as I wake up in the morning, or I don't need to go and smoke as soon as I get home from work, whatever it is. And they can't, if someone says, hey, do you want some? Their impulse is, yes, let's do it, which can lead to a lot of problematic behaviors depending on the crowd of people you hang out with. People who tend to be risk takers, again, those people with very high stimulus responses, or they're just stimulus seekers, these are people who tend to react positively to stressful events, but they also tend to be people who really want to see what's going to happen. And so they often can be people who are trying lots of different substances because they just want to see what'll happen. Even if they don't put it in those kind of terms, that's basically the idea behind it. Okay? There are exceptions, okay? Not exceptions, examples. So, the examples of these kinds of addictions and the people who are doing them. Compulsive gamblers tend to have problems with impulse control. There are people who get addicted to exercising and are at the gym for 12 hours a day. That's an addiction, okay? Because, again, that exercise releases dopamine, and once you have that thing that makes you feel happy, you're going to keep doing it. If you have these kinds of behaviors, like substance is being used instead of a healthier coping strategy, remember, you can't just work out all day long and be an overall healthy person, because there are so many aspects to your health you're ignoring when you do that, including the social aspect. There's internet addiction, there's shopping addiction. These are things where in shopping addiction you just constantly want something new, to the point where you're not saving money for bills or groceries or something else like that. And part of this comes from that idea of fear of missing out, because you don't want to be that person wearing that dress that someone's already seen. But that's kind of a silly thing, because we all have, we're not all constantly changing our clothes. It's silly to think that you can never be seen in the exact same outfit, because that's just how clothes work. So but there are people who've got in their head that they can never let that happen. They always have to have the newest fashion, this, that, and it becomes very problematic for them in their lives. Okay, so who misuses drugs today? So, this apparently didn't work. Okay, so characters of people who don't use drugs tend to be the people who perceive drug risk as risky and they disapprove of it. They have positive self-esteem and self-control, and they are socially competent. They sometimes are optimistic. They have high academic achievement. They, a lot of times you see this, they are regular church or synagogue or temple or mosque attenders, and they have strong family ties. So these things work in concert with this idea that if they have very strong religious affiliations, they probably have a heavy disapproval in their life saying, no, don't do drugs. Or they have that social backbone that's going to, and that familial backbone that's going to say, we're here to help you with your dopamine. No, your mom doesn't say that. I'm here to help you with your dopamine. But by being with your family, that does because we're social animals, we get rewarded for being around other animals that are our own species. And so by going back to your family group or your tribe, as it's called sometimes, you get that reward response, and then you don't have to seek out drugs. And that's assuming you have a strong, non-abusive family. So what about youth that are at highest risks? Okay, so there is a misproportionality where that tends to focus on males that are troubled and thrill seekers that tend to definitely be the highest risk factors for people who are going to try drugs. Very often in a dysfunctional family because they come from an environment that is unsafe, it's not consistent, and their stress response is constantly active. So if your stress response is constantly active, your brain is going to be saying, I need something to help me feel better because I can't feel horrible all the time. And so then you tend to look to drugs and alcohol. If you're in a peer group that accepts it, because again, we're social animals, if another peer says, no, just try it, you're more likely to try it. And this isn't as big a problem as, like, again, that 80s program DARE said, where, every single person's going to pressure you into using drugs. No, because it's just not what happens. But if you are with people who are regularly using drugs or alcohol and abusing them especially, you're going to be more likely to abuse it yourself. We see that people from poorer classes tend to be more, they're in a lot more stress. They have this constant fear of where am I going to get my next food? Where am I going to get what's going to happen next? They're in unstable environments, so drugs tend to, or any kind of substance use is going to be what helps them kind of get through the day, so that's problematic. And interestingly, in girls dating older boys, which is a strange statistics that pops out in people trying drugs. So this could be a stress response, or it could just be a weird statistic that we see. All right, so what are the risk factors for misuse and addiction? There are physical factors that pop out. We get brain chemistry changes in people who are using drugs and alcohol. You get metabolism differences. You could either really speed up your metabolism or you can kind of turn it off completely, and that becomes a big problem. There are physiological factors such as mental disorders. You see, especially in people who are already predisposed for mental disorders like bipolar or schizophrenia, you see that get amplified in people who use certain drugs. We see social factors that become risks. Oh, and I'm actually reading this the wrong way. I'm reading it backwards. So these are things that could lead to more misuse and addiction. So if your brain chemistry or your metabolism are such that you're like, I'm just going to... for example, with alcohol, if you process alcohol faster, you get drunk faster. And so if you have a higher metabolism, you get drunk faster. You tend to be a lightweight, as they say, and so you may not drink as much. But if you have a slower metabolism, you might drink more and become more addicted. If a lot of times people who have mental disorders to try and avoid whatever it is their mental disorder is causing them to think or feel, they might take drugs. We talked about how if you come from... poverty, or if you're dealing with a dysfunctional family or peer group, those could be risk factors that could lead to drug use. So what happens when you're taking drugs? So what is happening? What's the effect? We have this predictable change in brain chemistry, which means certain pathways are always activated under the use of certain drugs, okay? We see neurotransmitters changing, and their entire action could change, okay? So cocaine causes dopamine increase, which is reinforced in the brain. Dopamine is going to stay in the synapse longer and make you feel happier for a lot longer than, say, running a marathon or having good sex or something like that, eating a cupcake. So these are kind of peripheral, like, oh, yay, little responses. But cocaine actually causes dopamine to stay in the brain longer. And so you feel better longer until you start to become tolerant, and then you have to take higher and higher doses of cocaine. Same way, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, and amphetamines also affect your dopamine levels. That's why people tend to take them. It makes them feel good. Otherwise, why are you going to shoot something into your veins between your toes if it doesn't make you feel good? Okay, so, don't care. Let's keep going. Let's see. So there are different effects that vary depending on three different things. Okay, so drug factors, so the properties, the dose, the amount you're having it, and when you're taking it, how much you take at a certain time in your day, how much you've used in the past, how you use it. So there is so whenever you inhale a drug, it tends to go to your brain a lot faster. It kind of skips the blood-brain barrier and goes straight to your brain. When you inject it, it's slower than if you were to inhale it, but faster than if you were to eat it. Because if you eat a drug, it's going to have to go through your digestive system, and that takes a while, and it's very, very selective, okay? So if you put it directly into your bloodstream, it goes faster, and inhaling it is the fastest. So what kind of examples do we see? We actually see, there was this big case in public school for a while, in public high schools, where people were taking, at least there was reports that people were taking tampons, soaking them in alcohol, and then inserting them into anal or vagina regions, and then just sitting in class with them, so that thinking they would get drunk by taking alcohol in through those mucous membranes. And they did, but you take it in so fast that you could actually get blood poisoning, or alcohol poisoning, and die. And that actually happened at least once in a case where a married couple was giving each other wine enemas, so they were putting alcohol directly into the rectum, and the lady who was giving her husband sherry, which is already a very, not the name sherry, but the wine sherry, it's already a very intensely alcoholic wine, she was injecting it into his rectum, where there's a lot of, it's very easy for things to get into the bloodstream that way, and he got alcohol poisoning from basically what would have been totally fine if he had drank it, but taking it in the other way that put it into the bloodstream so much faster actually killed him. Okay, so that's an example of how you use it becoming, it definitely changes how the drug affects you. Okay. There are user factors that affect how a drug affects you. So body mass is a big one. So for example, someone who, you see this in alcohol use, any kind of dosage really, if you are someone who's very small, if you have very low amount of body fat, you're going to be affected by drugs or alcohol much quicker than somebody who is taking the exact same dose but is larger, has more body fat, has just more body mass, okay? Same thing, if you are healthier, you're less likely to be affected, and if your genetics are working with you, okay? If you aren't as healthy, your body's kind of grasping for anything, and so you might be more likely to be affected by drugs. If you have other drugs in your system, then that can also affect how your drug works. This even works with prescription medication. If you're taking, this is why you always disclose to a doctor what medication you're taking. They don't care if you're taking your mom's cough medicine as long as you tell them, okay? They might give you a lecture, but if they're about to prescribe you something that could potentially interact badly with your medication, you don't want to die just because you had a sip of your mom's cough medicine. Just fess up. I have a friend who used to do this all the time. You know, she and her mom would get the same illness, so they'd just share the same medication. And then when she'd go into the doctor, she was like, oh, I can't tell them. They'll get mad at me. No, that's stupid. You always want to tell your doctor these things. They don't care. They're not going to be like, I can't believe you took her migraine medication. How dare you? They might a little bit, but they'd rather know that you're safe, okay? We also see that expectations from a user affect how a drug works. And you see this a lot with alcohol, where people will say, oh, well, white wine makes me act this way, and whiskey makes me act that way, and But it's all about predisposing your brain. You can even trick people into thinking they're high by telling them they're taking drugs when they're not. They have this expectation that, well, if I drink this Dr. Pepper and take this aspirin, I was told that I'm going to get really, really high. It will not get you high, FYI. But I have heard people do this. I have witnessed it myself. And so someone was told, hey, this pill, if you take it with Dr. Pepper, it's going to make you really high. You're going to start to feel this way and that way. And so the person, because they've been told that they'll feel that way, will start acting like they feel that way. It's this weird placebo effect that our brain gives us. Okay, so you see it a lot with people when they're talking about different kinds of alcohol. You see it with young people who are trying, or just very naive people who've never taken a drug before, and all of a sudden they're told, well, I know that I'm supposed to be acting this way, and they think that's what they're feeling because our brains are weird. There's also social factors, okay? So wherever your physical and social environment could change how a drug affects you. You also, I was just listening to a podcast where somebody was he had been caught and he was about to be convicted for murder, so he took a cyanide pill, and they described it, he was too excited to die. And so that sounds like, what that doesn't make any sense. But what it means is metabolism and his stress response was so active, the drug just passed right through his system without affecting him. Okay, so depending on your physical and social environments, that can very much change how a drug affects you. So how do you prevent drug misuse? Okay, there's all these governmental effects and anti-drug education programs. A lot of times, if they're very heavy-handed, such as the DARE program I was in when I was a kid, they work the exact opposite. So these scare tactics that are often used actually make people more curious about them. So I remember a friend who was like, I'm going to take weed. It's going to be exciting. I'm going to have hallucinations. And then they did, and they were kind of bummed out because it didn't do what DARE said it was going to do. And so it's kind of a weird thing. Anti-drug education programs work sometimes. You have to be working with a group of people who already are on the fence, and so you can kind of convince them not to. There are indirect approaches, such as helping people out of poverty. That's a big one. If you help people out of whatever it is that is the root of all these problems, then they're going to be more likely to help themselves get away from these kind of drug problems. You can also increase self-esteem, improve academic skills, increase recreational opportunities, and this has happened a lot in a lot of communities where if you provide a lot of like free internet, if you provide free access to sports and sports equipment and that kind of thing, you just give people other things to do, they're less likely to use drugs, but you don't tell them it's so you don't do drugs, because then that's rude and kind of undermines the whole system. There are direct approaches where you tell someone specifically, and this is what health classes used to be. It used to be, look at this drugged out lung, this person's dying, oh my god. That is not really, that works for some people, it scares them straight basically. But for other people, there's a disconnect, and they're like, well, that's never going to happen to me. I'm young, I'm immortal, it's never going to happen. And so that doesn't always work. There's also peer pressure resistance. We see this huge difference now in people who smoke cigarettes. Often, people who used to smoke cigarettes, they would do it as a social situation. Now, so many of their friends have quit. They're like, well, why am I smoking if I'm the only person who's smoking? I don't want to do this anymore. So you just see this kind of phase out of certain kinds of drugs because people are like, no one does that. Why are you doing that? Hopefully you're not going to be offended, but if you're somebody who vapes, vaping is very much something that's made fun of because you look silly. And it's, for some reason, it doesn't change the addictive factor, but for some people that can be enough to be like, well, I'm not going to vape anymore. I look like a dork. And so that is something that could be a peer pressure resistance to avoid doing drugs. So what happens if you are truly addicted and you have access and you have the means to get access to this drug? How do you deal with treatment? Okay, what kind of treatment is there? There's medication-assisted treatment, and usually this happens at treatment centers. If you're in California, the Kaiser system has a really good medication-assisted treatment. There's a lot of medication. The one people think of the most is methadone for heroin addicts. Methadone itself is not great, but it's better than heroin, so it's easier to get off of methadone than it is heroin. And so you go through these treatment centers where they give you the alternative drug to help you get off of it. There's now also an alcohol resistance drug and a tobacco resistance drug to help you wean yourself off of the addictive effects of alcohol and tobacco. There is very, very often self-help groups, and peer counseling helps people because it makes you realize you're not alone in what you're suffering. So if you're someone for some people who hate these kinds of things will go and be like, Oh, that I'm not the only person. Like, I feel like I've done horrible things, but really I haven't, because look, we're all in this together. So things like AA and Narcotics Anonymous, etc., those kinds of things are really effective for some people. All right. There are harm reduction strategies such as methadone maintenance and syringe exchange programs. So there's a lot of side effects that go into the illegal drug trade, such as people reusing syringes or sharing syringes when they're dealing with not cocaine, hello, with heroin. And so they're injecting heroin into their veins and then sharing a syringe with people, and that's very, very dangerous. You can get a lot of bloodborne pathogens that way. So there are a lot of places that give free syringes because they just want, like, if you're going to be addicted, well, you should at least be safe in what you're doing. Okay, so that becomes something that people can that programs provide. And then as you help people trust you more by providing things like syringe exchange programs, they may be more likely to go in for some of these other treatments to help them get off of their drugs. There is this idea of codependency. There are people who often might enable the drug user, so they're codependently enabling them. Like, oh, if my partner is not drunk, he's really mean, so I'm just gonna get him alcohol to make him calm down. So that's codependence. It's not healthy for anybody. Okay? Or, oh, you're so much nicer when you're on your drug. Oh, I'm gonna help you get some. Or why don't you just take a hit? It'll make you feel better. None of these are good behaviors, and they are all codependent. And so a lot of time, the codependent person also needs to go in for some sort of treatment, so at least therapy, so that they can realize what they're doing is a codependent behavior, and what they're doing to their partner is not beneficial. Okay, alcohol use. It's legal. It's been legal for a long time. When it was illegal, bad things happened. We got the mafia, etc. Let's talk about excessive use of alcohol. So there's something called alcoholic use disorder, and there's two criteria that you have to meet to have a mild disorder. If you have more than four, you're considered alcoholic. You have alcoholism. Okay. If you are somebody who binge drinks for a very long time, if you cannot control your alcohol use, if you spend excessive time in using alcohol or recovering from its effects, if you have a strong desire or craving to use it, oh, there's more. If you have persistent alcohol use causing a failure to fulfill obligations at work. So this is like those other criteria. There's just so many things that if you can check more than four off of them, then you are alcoholic. So things such as if you go into withdrawal anytime you are not drinking. If you go into, you have to have just a little bit of alcohol just to get out of bed in the morning. Oh, that's bad. That's a kind of tolerance. That means you are very much addicted. If you are if you skip activities because you'd rather be drinking, if you use it, if you wake up with hangovers very, very often, etc., you could be alcoholic. And this is a very big problem in the U.S., okay? So this is up there with opioids, and it kills so many people, but alcohol is legal. And so what do we do about it? We can't just cut it off, because that doesn't work. We have to try and teach people how to use alcohol responsibly, right? So if you have somebody with extensive problems with alcohol, you could also have problems with tolerance and withdrawal. So the warning signs of if you're worried, like, oh no, am I an alcoholic or am I just a college student learning how to drink and figure out my social situations, here are some warning signs, okay? If you drink alone, if you use alcohol deliberately and repeatedly just to get through difficult situations, like these could be, I'll go to that party, but I'm not going to be able to talk to anyone until I've had at least 2 drinks, and then Fun Megan comes out. No, that's bad. If you're using alcohol to self-medicate, okay, so that the idea there being, I don't feel really good, but I just need a drink and then I'll feel better. Okay, if you find yourself feeling very nervous, if alcohol is not available, if you start drinking more and more, just a little bit more, those are bad warning signs. If there are risky situations that you decide, well, I'm just going to drink some alcohol because I make better decisions when I'm drunk. Oh, that's false. If you drink in the morning, okay, these are all, if you're drinking whiskey instead of water, if your urine is very, very dark colored because you drink so much alcohol and not enough water, these are all very bad warning signs that you might be alcoholic. So, what is binge drinking? So, binge drinking is a pattern of rapid periodic drinking that brings your blood alcohol content, or BAC, up to 0.08, so the legal limit, or higher, and this happens in 2 hours, and usually with 5 or fewer drinks for men and 4 for women. Women have a higher metabolism for our sizes, and so we tend to metabolize alcohol faster. And guys are just bigger; they can drink more without the effects. So there are risks and dangers to this, okay, especially in students' lives. So this is where you're more likely to engage in unplanned or unprotected sex. It could be to cause this either directly due to the sex or due to other problems. You get academic and social problems. Not me personally, but a story could be, I was going to write my term paper this weekend, but there was that party that I had to go to, and I just kept drinking. I just always had a drink in my hand, and then suddenly the next day happened, and I had to recover, and I was those are problematic, okay? And that's not even counting stuff like accidents and etc. Okay, so remember, daily common patterns of excessive alcohol misuse include regular daily intake of large amounts of alcohol. Even if you limit it to just the weekends, but you're heavily drinking on the weekends, that can be a problematic sign. If you have, this could be, rather than abuse, this is misuse. Okay, so long periods of sobriety interspersed with binges of heavy drinking lasting for weeks or months. So that's not great. You could be like, well, but I've been sober for 12 weeks. Now I'm going to go drink for a week. Well, that's not healthy. That's just not healthy at all. If you only drink when you're really, really stressed, well, if it's a glass of wine, that's okay. If it's a 2 bottle of wine night by yourself, that is problematic. Okay, so heavy drinking, not great. Because what happens, you get really, really highly tolerant to the alcohol, so then you have to take more and more, and then you start to get withdrawal symptoms when you're not using it. What withdrawal symptoms can be horrible. You can have seizures, you can have just mental confusion, you can have hallucination, you could have the DTs, people call them the detoxes or the shakes. This is delirium tremens. This is where your muscles just start to shake, and it's because it's just called going through withdrawal. And it's very uncomfortable and it's really unhealthy. You could also experience blackouts and nutritional deficiencies, including dehydration. You could, maybe you don't feel so hungry when you're drinking, especially if you're drinking heavily, or you just forget to eat. Well, if you're not eating, you're not providing one of those very, very basic needs that you need, which is food and nutrition, which is a big problem. Having strong willpower is not enough to stop alcoholism because it is a disease. Okay, so it's just like saying, I broke my leg. Well, I'm going to will it into being better. That doesn't help. Okay, if you have alcoholism, people who are affected cannot control or limit their drinking once they start. So the easiest thing is to just not be around it at all. Denial, one of the big cliches, is the first step in helping yourself with a problem is admitting you have a problem. Because a lot of times these people say, no, I'm fine. What are you talking about? That doesn't happen to me. I can control everything. But then that leads to, well, no, I'm fine. I can drive. I only had a couple drinks. That is very dangerous. That's illegal and very dangerous. Okay, these physical traits can also include if you have a flushed or veiny face. So if you start to see people's noses get really red, the capillaries start to burst in the nose when you're drinking alcohol, and you get that really characteristic alcoholic face. You can get random bruises on the body, either from being drunk and bashing into things, or just areas where your veins aren't as strong. The blood kind of seeps. You can get a husky voice. I'm not really sure where the correlation with this comes from. Usually, husky voices come from your testosterone. You have a growth of some sort. You get testosterone in the bloodstream. Testosterone makes muscles grow, and your larynx or your voice box is a muscle, and so then you get bigger muscles, which means a deeper voice. Usually, though, if someone, if you're hanging out with someone and you come back later and they suddenly have a deeper, huskier voice, a whiskey voice, then that is a sign they've been drinking. It's not definitive, so don't freak out if they have it. But if they have that husky voice, they have a flushed face, their hands are trembling, they have kind of a upset stomach continually, that's chronic gastritis or inflammation of the stomach. What's happening is, calm down, Kimball. My dog is upset. What's happening is the alcohol is causing an irritation of the stomach lining. All of these things could be signs that someone you know or love, or that you have alcoholism. Okay? The exact cause it's, we know so many things, but we don't know what causes alcoholism because it's not necessarily alcohol. It helps the dopamine response, but that's not all that's happening because so much else is happening. There could be a genetic factor to it, okay? There could be personality disorders which just predispose you to alcoholism. We know this to be true. There is, if you drank as a teen, you're more likely to become an alcoholic, especially if there's a lot of peer pressure involved, and if you have alcohol around. So if you grew up in the house of an alcoholic, not only do you have that genetic predisposition, but you just have that alcohol present. So everyone experiments with alcohol, okay? Most people experiment with alcohol because it's the drug that is very readily available. And we're not talking about like sneaking sips of vodka and then putting water back in the vodka and putting it back in the freezer. Like that's just experimenting. But if you are stealing alcohol from your parents, or if you are just, somebody told me once that, oh, you must be an alcoholic because you have like 3 bottles of liquor on your bar. And I was like, no, if I was an alcoholic, they would all be empty. These are just gifts that people have given me. And so that's kind of, the availability of alcohol makes it more likely that you're going to drink it, especially if you're alcoholic. I had this one chocolate liqueur once that was just so sweet. You can't drink it. Oh my God. It's just, it tastes like a melted candy bar. Like, to drink too much of it just hurts you, and it just does. It's not pleasant. But I had a friend who's alcoholic, and he stayed over in house sat for my dog once, and he only stayed a night, and I came back, and all of that chocolate liqueur was gone because he was so alcoholic. He was like, well, it tastes gross, but I need alcohol, and so he drank it all. And so that kind of problem happens. It's not about how it tastes; it's about making your brain happy. Again, if you're around somebody that drinks, you're more likely you could become alcoholic. And if you don't have good ways to manage your stress. So we talked about how stress is such a problematic problem. We all experience stress, but managing it is very, very important. You can become dependent on alcohol without being alcoholic, which is weird, but it's just something to consider. So if you are just basically addicted to the feeling of alcohol, and you always have it around and you always make a point of getting it, that can be a problematic behavior because what alcohol does is it goes to your liver is trying to clear the blood all the time, and if your liver is having to clear the blood of what it thinks is a poison all the time, it's going to become, it's going to die, basically. That's how you get cirrhosis. Okay, so how much alcohol is in your drink? So the way to get alcohol out of your blood system is just to let it go. You can't throw up and not be drunk anymore, because what's happening is that you're drunk, your body's like, oh no, poisons, get it out, and you throw up, but the alcohol isn't in your stomach anymore at that point, so it's not going to help you at all. Okay, so, and it tends to be about 1 drink an hour is what you can process. Okay, so 1 drink, what does that mean? Is that a gigantic margarita at some place? No, it's 12 ounces of beer or 5 ounces of wine or 1.5 ounces of 80 proof liqueur, okay, or 80 proof liquor, okay? So that is, what is proof? That's how much alcohol is in the product, and it's 2 times the percentage, so 80 proof is going to be 40% alcohol. So beer tends to be about 4% alcohol, which is why there's such a big difference here. Your heavier beers are about 9% alcohol, which is 18 proof. Okay, so that is a very big difference between an 80 proof or even 160 proof, which is 80% alcohol. Okay, so I think when I was a kid, people made a big deal about Everclear because it's 190 proof. Well, that means it's, what did they say? It was almost 200 proof, which means it was almost 100% alcohol. Yeah, that's, why, people? Why? So gross. Okay, so, we basically just talked about this. All right. Alcohol also, one way I had a friend actually stop drinking is that she realized how many calories she was taking in as when she was drinking beer and even wine, because alcohol provides about 7 calories per gram, which is about 15 grams in a standard drink. So if you're worried about your caloric intake, alcohol is definitely a place you can start cutting it out, okay? So heavy drinking is defined as being more than 2 drinks a day or 1 drink a day for women, and and the reason why this is the definition is because you start to see these health problems. You start to damage the heart because you're changing the percentage of the alcohol in your bloodstream. It's becoming a little thinner. Your blood gets a little bit thinner, and so your heart has to work harder to pump it around. You get cirrhosis and inflammation of the liver because, again, the liver has to process all that alcohol. Alcohol is a kind of sugar, so you get inflammation of the pancreas because it's trying to deal with all of that sugar. You can get cancer of the mouth, throat, and voice box because you're putting alcohol over those things. I don't think we have a direct reasoning why alcohol does this. We just know that there's a very direct correlation. I remember in my health class in high school, we had to watch someone basically get their jaw cut off from mouth cancer. It was so gross, you guys. That's when I decided, yep, that's it. I'm never smoking because that is disgusting. But I'm not predisposed to have a tobacco addiction, so that's not a problem. You can get nerve damage in the arms and legs as a result of drinking heavily, and the reasoning is that you're not cycling to the ends of your nerves anymore because alcohol is thinning your body fluids. Okay, there is this was originally thought to be a scare tactic that people use, but it actually may be true that you start to get the death of brain cells that can lead to dementia if you're a heavy drinker. Okay, so we're really starting to look at how people end up with dementia and Alzheimer's looks to be related to the amount of plaque buildup in your brain, but dementia is when brain cells die and are not replaced. So your brain cells can be replaced, but it takes a long time, okay? And so with alcohol, you're killing brain cells faster, or at least killing their connections faster than you can heal them. For some reason, we, especially in women, see this increased risk of osteoporosis and perhaps breast cancer as a result of drinking. Why? We don't know yet, but it's a horrible thing. It's like, really? We don't have enough problems. Now we have to worry about this too? Fantastic. We see gender differences in drinking. Men are more likely to drink, misuse, and develop an alcohol disorder, and they tend to excessively drink beginning in their teens. Whereas women get intoxicated faster, and they feel the effects of chronic drinking sooner, but they become alcoholic at later ages. And so one idea is that because they're doing it at later ages, they develop more medical complications more often. And part of it is that it's more socially acceptable for guys to be drinking in public. This is a place where sexism is not helping us out, but it's getting more socially acceptable for women to be drunk in public. But the problem is there's so many rape cases where someone will say, well, but she was drunk, so I felt it was okay for me to have sex with her. That people get off, and so it's dangerous on many levels to be a drunk woman in public. There's a bigger biological risk. Okay, we talked about that. We also see ethnic differences. African Americans drink less alcohol than most other groups. But they also have a disproportionately high level of alcohol-related medical problems and violence. What? Why? What? I don't know. It's just, again, a lot of these we don't have reasons for, but there are just correlations that we see. Depending on which Latino background you're coming from, you could see cultural differences. Again, in the same way that we see that Latinos tend to be the longest living ethnic group, if we're looking at African American, Latino, and white groups and Asian groups, a big part of it is they're so family oriented. And so if you are with your family unit more, you have less stress, you have less impetus to drink, and you might get a lot of peer pressure not to drink. So think of the family, that kind of thing. Asian Americans have lower than average rates of alcohol misuse, but they're genetically based. There is a genetical. Oh my goodness, I can't speak. There's a genetic predisposition that just makes it less. You get less of a dopamine response to alcohol, depending on which Asian Asian country you have family ties to. It's a genetic predisposition that works really well this way. In Native Americans and Native Alaskans, you get this very widespread and severe health problem that's incredibly bad and horrible and chronic, and a lot of it has to do with stress because there's such a these are two groups of people who are very just kind of the bottom of the barrel when it comes to getting public help, and it's horrible. Let's talk real quick to the end of this. Metabolism. So metabolism is how you break down molecules and build up new molecules, and this happens, we break down alcohol in the liver, And 2%, 2 to 10% of ingested alcohol is not metabolized, but it's secreted unchanged by the lungs, the kidneys, and the sweat glands. So if somebody has a beer sweat, they are literally sweating alcohol out of their pores. You can smell it. If you smell alcohol in someone's breath, it's literally just leaving the lungs the same way. It gets secreted into the lungs and then just from the bloodstream and then just leaves your body that way. It doesn't do it fast enough, though, for you to get sober, okay? Your kidneys also, so you may notice that you urinate more frequently when you use alcohol. That's because you turn off the hormone that tells you we need to retain water, we might be dehydrated. And so suddenly that hormone's gone, your kidneys are just like, don't retain any water, get rid of all of it, and you pee a lot. And you may have heard people say breaking the seal. So once you urinate the first time, after you started drinking, you're more likely to need to urinate again very quickly, and it's actually all in your brain, because when you've been holding it for a while and then you go urinate, it feels awesome. You're like, yes, urinating is great, and then you get a dopamine response because that's fantastic. And so then if you're drinking and you have a dopamine response, and drink alcohol is going to kind of retain that dopamine response, suddenly peeing feels great and you want to do it again to feel great again. And so you get this kind of continual urination response, which is bad because you can get really dehydrated. So the reason that we have breath and urine analysis for alcohol is because you can get a direct correlation between how much alcohol you have drunk or have been drinking and how much is on your breath or in your urine. Okay, let's keep on going. So, oh goodness, acute physiological effects of alcohol. What happens really quickly? It depends on how much you've had, okay? So it depends on how quickly you're having it. And how are you drinking alone? Are you eating while you're drinking? You're less likely to get drunk if you're eating at the same time than if you're just drinking alone. Again, your race, your gender, your ethnicity, etc., your genetics are going to affect how quickly you are affected by alcohol. So is your body weight and your percent body fat and your tolerance. Okay, so which of these can we control? We can control we can't control any of these, but we can control the rate of consumption if you don't have a very strong alcoholic tendency. So what is the blood alcohol concentration? What does that mean? Most people, if you have one or two drinks, you have a 0.05 per hour, you have a 0.05 alcohol content. You feel good, you have lowered inhibitions. If you have lowered inhibitions, then you aren't judging things as much, which means it might be harder for you to do critical thinking. It may alter your behavior. Keep going. If you double that, you start to get loss of motor coordination, and the reason why is our inner ear is basically a fluid with a little rock inside of it, and that rock moves around inside this chamber of that fluid, and as this is less than 1% difference, but if you make that fluid just a little bit less dense, that rock suddenly moves a lot faster, and so your brain thinks you're moving much more exaggeratedly than you really are, and so then you fall down a lot. Okay, so you can become clumsy. It makes it really hard to walk because you can't figure out where to put your legs. Talking becomes a lot more difficult because it's actually really complicated. Talking is so hard, you guys. This is why people tend to get lisps when they are really sleepy, when they are on drugs, when they're on alcohol, etc. Okay, you cannot drive when you're at 0.1. Okay, this is illegal. It becomes very, very hard to, if you have motor control problems and judgment problems, that's very dangerous for driving. Once you hit major alcohol, so we've gone from a 0.05, which is 1 or 2 drinks in an hour, to 0.4, which is about 8 drinks in an hour, you can become depressed. You can actually go into a stupor. You could pass out and maybe even go into a coma. And if you get up to 0.5, your breathing can stop because your body is just not responding anymore. And so your lungs stop responding, your heart won't respond. This is alcohol poisoning. Alcohol poisoning can start here. And a lot of times in alcohol poisoning cases, the peers who are with that person who's been alcohol poisoned will just drop their person off somewhere and be like, oh, good luck, goodbye, because they're also drinking and they don't want to get in trouble, which is really dangerous. How do you get sobered up? Vomiting will not help. It just irritates your stomach. Your body is trying to get rid of the poison in your blood, but it's in your blood. It's not in your stomach. So vomiting doesn't help. The only way to get rid of alcohol is to let it be processed by your liver, okay? So you can't magically become sober. There are people who said, but then it was like ice cold, like something happened and I was scared and suddenly I was sober. We might think you're sober because your sympathetic nervous system takes over because you're in a stress response because the cops showed up. But that doesn't mean, and you might be able to pass as sober if you're not too drunk, but you're still drunk. You're not going to be able to just automatically get rid of the alcohol that way. Let's see. You can get rid of a drink in an hour or two. Okay, so then it'll be fully metabolized. Do coffee, cold showers, exercise, or drinking water speed this up? Not really. Okay, but it's still the fastest metabolism. Okay, so coffee, cold showers, exercise, none of these things really help it up. Exercise might help a little, but you're also very likely to hurt yourself. So that's a problem. Other drugs, though, take a lot longer to leave our system. So methamphetamines take 3 days. Barbiturates can take 3 weeks. So that's why there are things called hair tests where you can go in and they'll test your hair follicles or your hair strands to see, well, where in the whole time that you've been growing this hair, you can see exactly where in that time someone took cocaine or something else like that. Cocaine stays in your system about 4 days, but it gets deposited in your hair as it's growing. Opiates take about 2 days. Pot takes 5 days or more, depending on if you're doing it 4 times a week. If you're a heavy chronic smoker, it can take up to 20 days to get rid of pot. All right. So, why is alcohol use bad? You guys, there are many bad effects of alcohol, like alcohol poisoning. You can die so quickly. You can get liver failure if you've been drinking for about 20 years. If you use alcohol with other drugs, you can get a lot of weird side effects, bad side effects, which is very problematic. There is a weird tendency to become more violent in people who are aggressive, like they're already aggressive, and all of a sudden their inhibitions are gone, so they can no longer inhibit their aggression. Suddenly they can, there's a lot of bar fights that happen as a result. Sexual decision making becomes problematic, can become problematic. You're less likely to be safe in your sexual behaviors if you are drinking. But there's a lot of studies that show maybe having 1 drink a night can reduce coronary heart disease. Okay, so, and it's because maybe if you're actually thinning the blood, you get less blood pressure. Okay, so that might be good. But, this is not a good reason to go out and binge drink in the weekends, because the idea is you're having like half a glass of wine at dinner, and that might help you be safer when you're older and you have high blood pressure. Okay, so if you have chronic alcohol use, you can affect your nervous system by your cells can die, they can atrophy, and you can start bleeding in your brain, which is so terrifying. You get shakes and tingles. Your skeletal system will stop depositing as much calcium because you're not eating as much, not eating well. Your urinary system will become inflamed. Your cardiovascular system, you can get high blood pressure, you can get scar tissue and fat accumulation in your cardiovascular system, which can lead to plaque buildup, which can lead to aneurysms and strokes. You can have an irregular heart rate. If you have an irregular heart rate, you're not delivering oxygen in good ways, so that's a problem, and you're more likely to get a heart attack and a stroke. So, scary. You guys, these also leads to low birth rate. You get a decreased amount of sperm for some reason. We don't exactly know why. It can lead to difficult labor because your blood pressure is different. Fetal alcohol syndrome, we won't look at pictures of that, but if you are alcoholic and drinking while pregnant, and usually it's the first month, there's no placental connection. So a lot of times people don't know they're pregnant for the first month of pregnancy. But then in the second month of pregnancy, the placenta is fully formed, and whatever you eat goes into the fetus. So if you're drinking alcohol, you're giving alcohol to a developing fetus, and that starts to interfere with specific pathways. And you get fetal alcohol syndrome, which can be very problematic in developing mental pathways and intelligence. Impotence can be a problem because there's a correlation between alcohol use and the lack of erection. Oh, there's that. Your digestive system, you can get cancer. We talked about this. Gastritis, ulcers, more cancer. You guys, just chronic alcohol use is so dangerous. Just avoid it. Be safe about it. That is all I want to say. Just be safe. I don't really think we need to go harp over this more and more. Remember, this class is all about helping you make healthy choices. There's no reason to scare these things into you. Just be smart about the choices you're making. Okay? Okay. Bye.